War is the darkest reflection of humanity. Where there is war, there is death, destruction, and suffering. But sometimes, amidst the chaos and pain, inexplicable signs emerge, moments that transcend human brutality and reveal something greater. This is the story of an event so extraordinary that it continues to defy logic to this day, a miracle that marked history, revealing the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. To understand this event, we must go back to the 16th century, a period of intense religious conflicts that tore apart Europe. At that time, the continent was divided between Catholics and Protestants, and the Catholic faith faced immense challenges. Churches were looted, priests were persecuted, and faithful were killed for defending their belief. In the midst of this turmoil, in a small town called Montreuil, in what is now France, a group of Franciscan monks lived in a modest monastery, dedicating their lives to prayer and service to the community. They believed in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist and protected the sacrament with fervor and devotion. It was then that an army of mercenaries known as the Warriors of the Reformation invaded the town. They had one goal: to eradicate any trace of Catholicism. Their tactics were brutal, and their actions left a trail of destruction wherever they went. On that fateful day, the soldiers marched to the Franciscan monastery and broke down its doors. The monks, upon realizing the invasion, tried to protect the tabernacle where they kept the consecrated hosts, but they were helpless against the fury of the attackers. The mercenaries desecrated the altar, broke sacred images, and with mocking smiles tore the monstrance from the tabernacle. To them, it was nothing more than a mere piece of bread, a meaningless symbol. Laughing, one of the soldiers threw the consecrated host to the ground and trampled it, as if crushing any trace of the Catholic faith. But then, something impossible happened. A profound silence took over the church. The soldiers, once arrogant and filled with hatred, stood still. One of them's eyes widened when he noticed that, beneath his feet, the desecrated host began to bleed. The blood flowed inexplicably, running across the stone floor of the monastery. At first, it was a drop, then another, until a small stream of red formed. The soldiers recoiled, some trembling, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing. This was impossible. It was as if Christ himself was there, weeping over the desecration. The monks, who had been pushed into a corner of the church, fell to their knees. Tears streamed down their faces as they watched the miracle unfold before their eyes. They knew they were witnessing a divine sign. The Eucharist was real, Christ was present, and at that moment he had chosen to manifest himself. However, instead of surrendering to the miracle, the soldiers became enraged. Their pride blinded them, and instead of recognizing what was before them, they decided to erase any trace of the event. That blood, that living proof, had to be destroyed. One of the leaders ordered the church to be set on fire and the monks captured. No Catholic could survive to tell what had happened there. The persecution began immediately. The soldiers went from house to house, demanding that the citizens hand over any priest, monk, or religious who was hiding. When people refused, they were beaten and threatened. But even under torture, no one betrayed the Franciscans. The people of Montreuil believed the miracle needed to be protected, that the sacrifice of those monks was a testimony of faith. Even so, one by one the monks were captured. Among them was Brother Thomas, an elderly man whose unshakable faith inspired all around him. He had spent decades serving the community and now found himself before the soldiers who had condemned him without trial. His face, marked by time, showed no fear, only serenity. When ordered to renounce the Eucharist to save his life, his response was clear: "I have lived my life for Christ, and I will die for him." The Eucharist is not a symbol, it is the real presence of our Lord. These words sealed his fate. The monks were taken to an improvised cell where they were tortured for days. The soldiers wanted to break them, force them to deny their faith. But one by one, even weakened, even on the brink of death, they refused. The suffering they endured was beyond human comprehension. They were deprived of food and water, beaten repeatedly, and finally forced to look at the desecrated hosts while being threatened with death. But none of them yielded. Each day, the soldiers grew angrier. How could these weak and defenseless men resist? How could they remain faithful when they had everything against them? The answer lay in what they had witnessed, the miracle of blood in the Eucharist. They knew that Christ was there with them, and no earthly suffering could drive them away from him. Then the final day arrived. The monks were taken to the center of the town, where a large scaffold had been erected. The commander of the mercenaries stood before them and gave them one last chance. "Renounce the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, and you will live," he said. There was a moment of silence, a brief instant in which the soldiers expected to hear words of despair. But instead, Brother Thomas raised his head and began to pray, "Our Father, who art in heaven." The other monks joined him. Their voices echoed through the square. The crowd watching began to murmur. The soldiers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Something was happening. Those men were about to die, but they had no fear. On the contrary, they seemed at peace. The commander clenched his fists. He knew he could not break them. He motioned with his hand, and the execution began. One by one, the monks were hanged, their prayers turning into silence. But even after their deaths, one last miracle occurred. The bodies of the monks, which should have shown signs of suffering and pain, appeared serene, almost smiling. There was no expression of agony, only an inexplicable peace. The soldiers who had killed many over the years had never seen anything like it. News of the martyrdom spread quickly. Decades later, when Montreuil was liberated and the monastery rebuilt, the place where the hosts had bled was preserved as a sanctuary. To this day, pilgrims visit that sacred ground, where the impossible happened, where faith became visible. The story of the monks of Montreuil and the miracle of the Eucharist remains alive, reminding everyone that, even in the darkest times, God's presence never disappears. Time passed, but the story of the martyred monks and the miracle of the Eucharist was not forgotten. The monastery of Montreuil became a pilgrimage site. Reports of healings and graces granted began to surface among those who visited the sanctuary. The blood that had flowed from the host was a silent yet powerful testimony to the real presence of Christ. But the story did not end there. Decades later, amid a new wave of religious persecution, a young man named Louis, the son of one of the soldiers who had participated in the massacre, discovered a secret that would change his life forever. Since childhood, Louis had heard whispers about what his father had done. The man who commanded executions and destroyed churches rarely spoke about those days, but sometimes, in moments of great torment, he mentioned the monks. He spoke of their serene faces, the miracle he had witnessed, and the guilt that consumed him. Louis grew up seeing his father struggle with nightmares and an anguish no man should bear. It was only on his deathbed that Louis's father decided to tell him the truth. With a weak voice, he confessed, "I saw it. I saw the blood. I saw those men die without fear. I saw something that should never have been possible, and I spent my life trying to forget." Then, with tears in his eyes, he held his son's hand and made a final request. "Go to Montreuil. See for yourself." Driven by the desire to understand what had tormented his father for so many years, Louis set out for the town. When he arrived, he found the monastery restored and the faithful still gathered to pray at the place where everything had happened. But he wanted more than stories. He wanted proof. During the night, when everyone was asleep, he sneaked into the church. He walked to the altar and knelt before the spot where, according to the reports, the hosts had bled. He touched the cold ground, and in that moment, something happened. A shiver ran through his body. He couldn't explain it, but he felt something he had never felt before. a presence, something beyond the physical, beyond the world he knew. The next morning, as he watched the faithful, an elderly priest approached him. "You are not from here," said the priest with a gentle smile. "What are you looking for?" Louis hesitated. Throughout his life he had learned to doubt, not to believe in miracles. But now he was facing something he could not ignore. "I want to know the truth," he replied. "I want to know if this really happened." The priest looked into his eyes and, without saying a word, led him to a room at the back of the monastery. There, inside a reliquary, was something that made Louis hold his breath. A small piece of cloth stained red. This cloth was used to try to clean the blood that came from the hosts, the priest explained, but the blood never disappeared. Louis stared at the relic in silence. His father had not lied. This had really happened. A miracle had manifested before violent men, and still they chose to ignore it. That revelation changed everything for Louis. He returned home a different man, with a fire in his heart that had not existed before. He began to question everything he had learned about faith and God. Months later, he made a decision that surprised everyone. He left his former life and entered a seminary. He wanted to dedicate his life to understanding that mystery, to deepen his faith, which so many had given their lives to defend. Years passed and Louis became a priest. He returned to Montreuil, no longer as a skeptic, but as a man of faith. It was at that monastery that he celebrated his first Mass, before the same altar that had been desecrated so long ago. And as he lifted the consecrated host, he understood something that could not be explained by words. At that moment he knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that Christ was present there. The story of the martyred monks was not just a memory of the past, it continued to live in each person touched by their testimony. The generations that followed grew up hearing about the miracle, about the blood that flowed, about the courage of those who chose death rather than renouncing their faith. Montreuil became a symbol of the resistance of faith, a place where the invisible became visible. Many people who doubted the Eucharist came to the monastery and left transformed. What had happened there could not be ignored. Decades later, an even more impressive event occurred. A group of skeptical scientists decided to examine the relic of the cloth with the dried blood. They conducted tests to determine its origin and composition. What they discovered left everyone stunned. The blood was human. And more than that, it had surprising characteristics. Detailed analysis revealed that it was blood type AB, the same found in other Eucharistic miracles around the world. The news spread quickly, reigniting interest in the miracle of Montreuil. The Church authorized a more in-depth study, and the Vatican officially recognized the event as a divine sign. Thus, the martyred monks of Montreuil were canonized and came to be known as the Martyrs of the Eucharist. From this recognition, the Montreuil monastery became one of the largest pilgrimage destinations in Europe. Thousands of faithful traveled to touch the ground where the blood flowed, to pray before the altar that witnessed the manifestation of the supernatural. Stories of miraculous healings continued to be reported. People who came as unbelievers left with transformed hearts. The testimony of the monks of Montreuil teaches us something that transcends time and circumstance. They show us that true faith cannot be extinguished by swords or threats, that the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist is a mystery that transcends human logic. That fidelity to God is more powerful than any persecution. Today, centuries later, we can still hear their echoes. We can feel the strength of their sacrifice, the love they demonstrated until their last breath. We can remember that, regardless of the difficulties, God never abandons us. If this story has touched your heart, help share it. Many people still don't know this impressive testimony of faith. Leave your comment below. Tell us what you think of this story. And if you want to continue following more stories that strengthen the soul and bring us closer to God, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. May the Lord and the Virgin Mary bless your life and your faith. See you in the next video.